back up to that silo out there. They said, no, we've been trying. She said, well, let's just see. So they backed it up, and she said, you guys just get out there in front. Don't get behind her. Just keep out there, and I'll try her. And I let her up there, and boy, at first she got bug-eyed and running backwards, and I just run her backwards. She stopped, and I talked to her, petted her a little bit, turned her around, and she walked up, and we walked in. 4 guys with their mouths hanging open and Cotton there. And he really hated that. In essence, he was really jealous. As Dottie said, I don't mean to brag, but I think she should brag. She said, I've been given a gift, and I didn't realize that for years later. I wasn't a real confident person. I can do tremendous things with horses. But I never really felt that confident. Then years later, I realized I came from a really great family of horsemen on both sides. Personally, I'm a really shy person. I'd go to a horse show with all these trainers that I thought were so much beyond me that I could end up showing really well against them. But I would end up showing really well against them. Here, these guys were training horses continually, and I could take a horse that I would ride, take an old ranch horse, work with it. We'd go in a race and win at a cutting. But yet I didn't think I could really go compete on that level. In 1965, she and Cotton got married, and she said that's when the real ranching began. They had some cattle of their own, but also looked after other people's cattle. She recalled one time gathering some strays. They had just about got them to the gate, and he just took off in 3 directions. She said, well, I took off after one of them, and I roped that sucker. And I didn't know anything about roping, but I roped this sucker, and I don't remember if he choked down or fell down, but stupid me, I managed to tie him down with a rope. Oh, God, I was proud. And I went loping up to her husband, and he had one rope, and he got the other one back, and he said, well, did you just let yours go? And she said, no, he's tied up down there. And he was, what? And she said, he's tied up down there. So they went, and he didn't say a word. And he just looked at it, all that, and got off and handed her the rope and said, here, you better take it. And she said, here, you better take it. And he said, no, by God, you're big enough to rope him. You're big enough to take him to the gate. And she said, so we got him through and let him go. We started back across the pasture, and I was just chattering away, asking him questions. Should I have done this? Should I have done that? He didn't answer me. He would not say a word. Later, he said, I wondered what the hell I married. I felt a real vicarious sense of pride and pleasure with that story. It's a good story. So she said, I had the opportunity, no, the privilege, to cowboy with what I consider some of the greatest old-time cowboys. So many of those guys, they were so different than it is today. They roped if it was necessary, but it was a disgrace to have to rope because you were supposed to be working together and riding good enough horses that you shouldn't let them get away. And it was just a good bunch of people that liked cowboying. They all really respected cow horses and knowing how to handle the cattle herd and holding them in firm and rolling them into themselves so you didn't let them get away. That was a real privilege. She said. With each of the women that I talked to, I always ask them, what do you want the world to know about the Flint Road? What do you want to share? Here's what she said. That was my mic. There seems to be a push to save the Flint Hills. Well, maybe those were already saved before all these well-meaning people got such an interest in them. People that know about them to continue to take care of them instead of coming up with all these ideas. The people who have lived here and had to make a living off the land appreciated it and took care of it because they knew if they didn't take care of it, it wasn't going to take care of them. So that was a lot of fun getting to hear those stories about those days working with those cattle. Another lady that I interviewed, Martha Hoy, she's not related to my Hoys, but I kind of wish she was. She was so much fun. Martha Hoy was born in Matfield Green in 1921. Her parents were the Johnsons. They owned a local phone company. Her mother operated the 24 plug-in switchboard in the front room. Martha and her sister enjoyed listening in on their neighbors' phone conversations. Besides owning the phone company, her father was the janitor of the Matfield Green School for 37 years, for which he was paid $100 a month. And Martha said she felt like they were the richest people in the world. It was a close-knit community. She remembers one night her sister was giving her a perm. So she went next door to get a bucket of water. Their neighbors weren't home, but she noticed that they'd left the iron plugged in and a fire had started. So she ran home, jumped on the phone line. All the neighbors came out with buckets. She said it ended up being not much of a party, but they had a really nice gathering that night. Every Christmas, her mother made their winter coats, and then their dad would go coon hunting. So they'd always have raccoon collars. But one year, their aunt came home, a home ec teacher, and she had bought Martha and her sis a new coat. And it was their first bought-in coat. She said, we were so proud we finally have a bought-in coat. Her father had been a minor league baseball player, and Martha and her sister grew up playing softball every chance they got. She said, I didn't know it then, and I found out later that I just had one eye, and I never could hit the ball. But it didn't matter because Sis made a home run every time she batted. Then once their younger brother was born, they didn't get to play quite so much. They had to stay in. She said they had to stay in over the noon hour and help with the dishes, and they could look out the window and see all the other kids at school on their lunch break playing softball, and they were in there washing the dishes. But they did keep up. They continued to play softball during high school. Martha said that one gal in high school, she was always finding something ornery to do. But, she added, she didn't have to twist our arms to do it. Once she enticed them down to the creek with a package of cool cigarettes and offered to teach them to smoke. Martha said she thought, well, hot dog. How will we get the smoke washed off? Oh, the ornery girl said, there's creek water over there. Well, according to Martha, that creek water didn't do a darn thing to cover up the smell of smoke. When they got back to school, their coach sent them to study hall, and they didn't get to play that day's game. Another time, the same rowdy girl gave them chocolate that turned out to be Ex-Lax. She said after that, we finally caught on to her that she really was smarter than we were. After high school, Martha went for a year to Emporia State, and her sister had a year at Wichita. They both returned to Matfield during the summer, and they played softball with the married ladies, they called it. And one evening, a guy drove up and asked her sister if she'd like to go to the picture show. And her sister declined, but Martha piped up, well, I'd be glad to go to the picture show with you. Later, they became engaged, and her sister asked if she could borrow Martha's ring to wear to Wichita. She said, nope, if you'd gone to the show with him, you could have had that engagement ring. So she taught school till she married in Marion County. She had to get to school early and build the fire, but the next year she moved to the school in Elmdale. And they had a gas stove, and it was nice and warm all the time, she said. She lived with a local family, as a lot of the teachers did at the time. The Davises she lived with, and she walked to school with their daughter every day. In 1942, she left teaching, and she and her husband, Jay, got married, and they moved to the farm. When they went to get married, Mr. Bradbury, the minister, said he could do it, but they'd have to wait till he and his family were finished with their baths. So the couple came back an hour later, and she said they had the cleanest wedding in Canada. Mama and all the kids, and even the little dog had a bath. She claimed she wasn't much of a cook. One of her earliest memories of marriage was trying to make a real impression on her in-laws at Thanksgiving with her special soft pies or meringue pies. She said they were really, really pretty. Unfortunately, she made the mistake of putting salt in the meringue instead of sugar. I made quite an impression on them. All the boys were good cooks, till I came along, and then they didn't use that word anymore. She said her mom and sisters could cook without a recipe, but she never could do that. She didn't know how to cut up a chicken when she first got married, though she knew how to kill it and dress it. But when her husband asked her if she knew how to cut it up, she answered, oh, sure. But after she cut off the wings and legs, she was stuck and didn't know what to do. So her husband had to finish up the job, and she said, it looked like a rabbit, but anyway, it tasted good after we fried it. She never did have to milk a cow, but it was her job to clean the separators, which was apparently quite a tedious task, especially if it was left out overnight to dry after dinner. So she was glad when they stopped earning a living from selling milk. Shortly after her first daughter was born, she joined a pinochle club. At the time I interviewed her, the original 12 ladies were still playing every month. And she said when they started, the 12 old gals took their kids along with them when they played. The hostess didn't play because she had to keep an eye on the kids in the hayloft and how they could keep them out of the creek. When the party was over, the hostess was in charge of feeding them. So the kids would get sandwich, fruit salad, and Jell-O, and the ladies would eat pie or fancy cake. They played every 2 weeks, and around Christmas time they had a special party. Whoever was the hostess was furnished the meat, and the rest all took covered dishes, and they played cards all day. And they ate. They ate all day, and the next day, she said, they all felt like they had the... She loved to ride horses. Her favorite horse was Fanny. She hadn't grown up riding, I think, but took to it when she was married. Her husband kept cattle, and every Sunday afternoon, the two rode out to the pasture to count them. Her husband always wrote the numbers down on a map book, she said. They kept their cattle till they moved uptown, and then they sold them all but one. The last one they butchered and put in the freezer, and she said that was the last good meat we had. And so that was in 1970 when they moved to Cassidy. And her mother declared that it was the nicest place she ever did see because it had a bathroom. And they didn't have to carry water in and out. And they had an automatic washer, not dishwasher, washing machine. So she had lived most of her life without those conveniences. Had quite a happy life. And I asked her the question, what do you want the world to know about the Flint Hills? And she says, the Flint Hills are a wonderful place to be. Doesn't make any difference what season it is. It's beautiful out. That's our home. And people come out and they would say, well, where's these Flint Hills? And I thought, you crazy people, open your eyes and you will see. I don't know how else we could let them know. Just look, it's home. That's all we know, that it's beautiful all the time. So I think that sense of home is a connection that many feel. So that was Martha. I also spoke with a woman in Madison named Zenith Lindemood, who had lived a little bit different life. She was an only child born to doting parents who were determined that their daughter would have an education. In fact, her mother never taught her to cook or milk a cow. She did not want to train her to be a housewife. When it was time for her to go to college, they were out in western Kansas, out in Norton. Rather than sending her to Hayes, where most everyone else they knew went, her parents picked up everything and moved to Lawrence, where they opened a boarding house for a year so their daughter could go to KU. Her father had heard that KU was a naughty school, and they wanted to get her settled safely in that wooded place. KU, she studied English and foreign languages, and after graduation in 1939, she took a job as a school teacher in Quincy, Kansas. I think I said she's from Eureka, but not. So when she got there, cars were not a part of their life then. The school board president and housed all the teachers in his house, and he and his family lived at the far end of Main Street, and the school was at the east end of town. So they all walked to school every day, no matter the weather. In early days, when there wasn't enough money to do things, teachers would hike out to the Quincy Bridge. It was an old-time arch iron bridge over the river, about a mile outside of town, to do things. They might even sneak a cigarette, she said. Sometimes they would all pile into the principal's car to go to a show somewhere. So she lived there in that boarding house with a school teacher in Quincy. And one afternoon, she and her roommate were walking downtown when they noticed a guy in a black felt cowboy hat. The hat was not too clean, as Zenith noted. He said something to get their attention. Her friend who already knew him said he was a nice guy, but I don't know that I'd want to marry him. The cowboy in the black felt hat, though, he liked Zenith more than anyone else, and she said, you was persistent, and I was agreeable. So her parents these weren't the expectations her parents had for her. She said her father he had higher expectations than for her to marry this little old cowboy. She said, I wrote to them that I was planning to marry this guy. My dad wrote back to him and said, if you really think you want to marry this cowboy, it'll be all right. And there was a but hanging there. That's not what we sent you to college for. But she did. She married him. She was warned by the school board, as many were, that if she got married, she'd be fired. That didn't stop them. They went out and headed out to Norton, where her parents lived, after Thanksgiving. She and her future husband, Deke Lindemood. Let's see, they stopped in El Dorado, made arrangements with the minister of the church, the Reverend Thomas O'Ferris of the Christian Church in El Dorado, to marry them. The minister's janitor stood in as witness. They wanted some music, so the minister's wife, who was baking bread at the time, came in, dusting off her hands, dusting the flour off, came in and played some music. And then they spent that night in Salina and headed on out to her parents in Norton. When they got back to Quincy a couple of days later, Zenith said later his pajamas came from the hotel where we stayed. I hadn't bothered to pick them up, and neither had he. But Deke charmed them. After they met him, he charmed them. And she said, we visited them, and they visited us. He introduced my dad to hunting. And we hauled a dog out to Norton so my dad could see how a pointer works. But they kept their marriage a secret for a while. Later in the spring, she finally told the school board that she was married. So she was fired. They hired Miss Ferguson, but at the end of the semester, Miss Ferguson got married, so they were out of the teacher then, too. The Lindemoods had a couple of kids. And then she said they used to struggle along with no salary from her. And then World War II came along, and she was welcomed back as a teacher and taught for the rest of her life. She said she always described to the principal that every man who wanted to be successful should marry a school teacher. In fact, her salary did allow them a lot of early luxuries. They were the first people in town to have an automatic washer and dryer, sometime in the late 40s, she said. Before that, of course, they used a wringer washer and hung the laundry out. They were also one of the first to get a water cooler air conditioner, which they said was just kind of made everybody's allergies worse with the water dripping. That didn't work so well. So Zena's mother had not taught her to cook. So when she got married, her mother-in-law, Grandma Lindemood, had to teach her. And she said one of her most memorable meals was when she had to cook for the men one day. They were helping her husband. And she decided to make biscuits. And those biscuits turned out hard as well. And she said she always loved her father-in-law because he said, oh, Zenith, these are the best biscuits I've ever had. And she said you could hardly gnaw on them. I mentioned that her husband taught her father to hunt. He was a skilled hunter, and she told a story of that as when he was a child, he would hunt all night, coons and possums or whatever they could catch. And then they would, or if they could find it, they would catch the school wagon, which was a woman driving a wagon drawn by a team of mules, in the morning somewhere along the way and go straight to school with their game in tow. His mother always cleaned his game of all sorts, and he had the idea that Zenith would do that too. And she started out with the best of intentions of being a good wife until her first pregnancy. And she said when he brought her a duck to clean, that ended it right there. She no longer cleaned this thing for that. She did, when necessary, learn how to prepare chicken. She said her mother-in-law taught her how to kill them. She would hang them from the clothesline and twist off the neck. It was never for me, Zenith said. I'd kill a chicken if anybody presented it to me. I've plucked a few, but I'd prefer not to. But I'd take some pieces and throw them in a pan. And her daughter Bobby, who was there with me that day, said her mother's fried chicken was very delicious, as I'm sure it was. She described her husband as a cowboy, a farmer, a community leader. He was an extrovert, and she considered herself an extreme introvert. She said, I just sat back and let him do the talking. And though he'd never gone to college, he was an avid reader. And one of the things Zenith brought to the marriage was her love of reading. No matter how limited their financial circumstances, she surrounded her family with books and magazines, and the Kansas City Star and the Kansas City Times. And without fail, they always took a vacation. even if only to Kansas City to attend a Kansas City A's baseball game. Sunday afternoon, Starlight Theater on a Saturday evening. And they'd stay at the Phillips Hotel downtown and shopped at the plaza if they could afford it that year. Her husband played town team baseball, and he broke his ankle one time, so Zenith had to take over milking the cow, which, as you recall, she was not taught to do when she was young. So after several bad experiences with that cow kicking the milk bucket over, she stormed into the house and announced, "Get rid of the cow or I'm leaving." Even as a child, she had resisted her father trying to teach her to milk. And as I said, her mother encouraged that. So in many ways, she was not the typical farm. She admitted she was not the typical farm wife because of her education and background. She never did take to writing. She said her brother-in-law, Bill, told her she couldn't ride because she was too heavy and horse would be sway back. Although she was very slender. But I didn't particularly want to ride, she said. And her husband never urged her, but he did put his daughter on horseback from the time she was a little bitty thing. So that's her daughter, Bobby. When Bobby was about 3 or 4, the family moved downtown, and Zenith would have to tie her to the clothesline with a rope so she wouldn't run back into town and get cookies and candy from Mrs. Lane and Mrs. Knowles. And her mother-in-law, Grandma Linda Moon, she despaired of Bobby's tomboy ways. She thought she was allowed too much freedom. And she always said, "Why can't you just straighten up like your cousin Kay and behave more properly?" Bobby did everything, climbed trees, played with dogs. She remembered riding steer one Easter Sunday when her grandparents came out to the farm. And Bobby and her brother Jimmy were really proud of the steer. They wanted to show off how they were going to ride it. But it threw her off and almost broke her. Her brother Jim had allergies, didn't really care that much about the farm work or any of that, but her father put him on the tractor, even though he would rather have been home reading a history book, he would say. And so Bobby said, "I would have given my eye teeth to do that." But she said that was back in the time when girls weren't encouraged to do that. Not his daughter, he said. The only time he would let her ride with him was after storms, checking gaps or something like that. She wasn't allowed to help move the cattle or anything like that, because it might be too rough and she might get hurt. Having met her, I think she probably could have handled it just fine. One of their main forms of entertainment was fishing. They went fishing a lot in the slough pasture, what they called Quincy Lake. Zenith's husband, Deke, and a few other men in town had built a brick fireplace out there where they could grill. They had good access to it. They built a floating dock so they could swim on it. They built a little dressing room so people could change their clothes. And they'd go out there and picnic. And an evening, she said, Deke would come in from the field. They'd take hot dogs out and have a picnic out by Quincy Lake. Zenith, she became a local historian and wrote a history of local musicians, their instruments, and the music that they performed in the county for barn dances and square dances. And a lot of times they would have dances upstairs in the upstairs of the grocery store. So she wrote that history. She also wrote a lot of poetry, some of which is published. The Flint Hills became her home. Zenith's home. She loved the grass and the hills, and she wrote poems such as "The Prairie, Yes." She was so intrigued with the prairie fires, driving at night and seeing them. She wrote a poem called "Scenes of Spring," greening, as the trees and grass start to green, when the trees start greening gradually. We're ready for that to start happening now. She said, "Is there any other place to live? I love them, the Flint Hills. This is where my soul lives, and I couldn't meet anyone else." So that is Zenith. And the last one I'm going to share with you today is some of the stories I got from Betty Kingston. And Betty Kingston was born in Cottonwood Falls on April 6, 1919, to Harvey and Ethel Myers Osborne. She had 2 brothers, 2 sisters. One sister passed away before she could remember. She was the 3rd girl, and a disappointment, she said, because they were wanting a boy. She said, "I'm sure they were wanting a boy, but they got me." But then they got a boy and another girl and then another boy. She was born at the edge of town in the Grandview Addition, in Cottonwood Falls. She went to grade school and high school there, graduated in 1937. School was great, she said. I wasn't a dummy. I could make an A in everything but penmanship. And when I was in 8th grade, I decided I was going to make all A's, and I did. Then, when I started high school, I sort of started majoring in boys. Her dad raised hogs for Clovercliff Ranch. He carried the mail for 30 years. He was a barber. He farmed a bit, a jack of all trades. Her mom stayed at home till the kids were fairly good size, and then she went to work in the dry goods store. Betty remembers her mother reading to them a lot in the evenings, stories out of magazines, just sitting around in the dining room. They went to their grandparents a lot on summer evenings, and they were a very musical family. Their mother would play the piano, and the rest of them would sing. She remembered one time when she got in trouble at school. She and her brother had played with some twins, Bus and Bud Howard, a lot. They were in the 5th grade, and the boys got a hold of a letter some ways or another that a teacher had gotten from her boyfriend. She remembers they were on the west side of the grade school there. There's a little building by the west door, and they were back and they were reading that letter, and the teacher caught them. And they had to stay in that little building. She said that was the only time she ever got in trouble. As they got older, they went to movies for entertainment. Bus and Bud had an old Model T. In a big pasture out west of town, there was a big hill there. So they would go up that hill. Sometimes they couldn't make it. They'd have to start going backwards again. There was a big swinging bridge across the river that they used to go and swing on. So that's what they did for fun. She said they always did their laundry on Monday. That's something I found to be a pattern fairly common. Ironing on Tuesday. She said the first that she remembered really doing the laundry was one of those machines that you pull back and forth. Of course, they always had to hang their clothes out on the line to dry. They could fold the sheets as they took them off the line so they didn't have to iron them. But other than that, they ironed everything, even the tablecloths. About 3 bushel baskets of clothes that were all sprinkled with water and then rolled out, and the next day they got them out and ironed them. In wintertime, they had a wood stove, but in summer, they heated with kerosene. First, they had flat irons, and then her mother had a gasoline iron. So, dangerous to me. They got electricity sometime in the 40s. So she graduated from high school, and she didn't go to teach like some of these other ladies did. She went and got a job in a government agricultural office called AAA, which was in the basement of the Chase County Courthouse. She was in charge of the grass business. This was before she ever knew she'd be involved in grass the way she was after she married Phil Pinkston. She first saw Phil. She said, I saw him playing at a dance. He used to play guitar at a dance. He and his brother Slim played the fiddle. They played barn dances, and this was over at Strong City. We were married November 4th, 1945. It wasn't much of a wedding. We were married at the Church of Christ in Topeka. No guests. Just another couple went with us. I wore a lavender 2-piece suit, which she recalls she could still fit into today. It was a real windy, warm day that day. We went to the Capitol building, went up the steps, and oh, the wind was just blowing a gale. We ate at the Kansan Hotel, and that was her first trip ever out of the Flint Hills. After the first couple of years of marriage, they bought the place where they would live the rest of their lives, which I visited, and was certainly very beautiful there. I love it, she said. I love it. I'm not talking about dollars, but I wouldn't trade this place for any place on the creek if I had to live there. I don't need a big house, never have, never did want a big house, and we have the best view in the country right here, and I just wouldn't trade it for any place. Her husband asked her if she would quit her job after they got married. He said, he didn't want me to work. He said if he couldn't make a living for a wife, he'd get rid of the wife. She did keep the books for the ranching enterprise and helped out in many other ways. She said, Phil and I worked together very well. He said, when we were working with our old cows, he'd rather have me than anybody else. Because I knew the old cows. I was familiar with them. He'd say, cut a certain cow, and I could cut her out. Other people didn't know. But she never helped with when all the boys, the 4 Pinkston brothers, were working. But she also didn't cook their lunches. Her husband told her, now, you are not going to have to cook for the cowboys, because she hated to cook. She said she preferred to be a Her husband would say, now be up at a certain pasture at a certain time, take us back to our pickups and trailers and stuff, or bring us into town to eat. And she liked that, and she did all the bookkeeping for the operation and for several other operations too. And she showed me she still got all of her books that she meticulously kept. Really a treasure. Those books she made. She had a garden, got water out of the creek. Still loved green beans, so she always had green beans and beets. She always made pickled beets and tomatoes and potatoes, and that was all they did with gardening. At first they raised chickens just to help make a living, but her husband didn't like chickens. So they didn't do that for a lot. Didn't like to eat chicken, didn't like fried chicken. So they didn't keep chickens for long. They did milk some cows. She said her husband milked 5 cows for a while. But milking cows and cowboying didn't work because sometimes they need to milk them at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So he just decided to make nurse cows out of them. And they made more money than a regular stock cow, she said. We had one old Holstein cow that raised 4 calves. Always raised 2 calves on every cow. Her calf would pay the pasture bill of her fee, and that extra calf was profit. So she says she was willing to milk the cows, but her husband said no, he was not going to have me milking cows. He was very considerate, the most considerate person I ever knew in my life. Of course, I'm probably partial, but I've never known anybody that took so much consideration. When I look back on my life, it couldn't have been better. It just, I don't know. She often helped, as I mentioned before, helped her husband on horseback. And she told one story once that when they were bringing some cows and calves in, and a storm was coming up, and it was a tornado. She said, we were out here in this little pasture, and Phil said, just keep it moving. I'll look ahead and get the gate open. But he said, just keep it going. And so we got them in and got them in the lot, and the storm hit south of Cedar Point, out in the pasture. That's where it went down. We could see it dangling around out there. I'd like to help him if it wasn't too hot, she said. She recalled a time it was one early fall, must have been early fall, she said, because it was warm. And I know I went with them because I know I had on my cowboy boots, but he wouldn't let me ride without my boots because it was safer. And then I had on shorts. He said, I'll take this draw and you take that draw. And here came a cowboy from the south. Well, he just kept coming towards me, and I just kept it going towards him. Anyway, it was one of the Talkingtons. And he said, I couldn't figure out who in the world was out here in shorts and no hat. She said, I love to talk about the Flint Hills. It's God's country. It's God's country. You get on a horse and you go out here horseback, and it's just a different feeling. I really can't explain it or describe it, but it's a different feeling. It just makes me cry. So that is a sentiment that I think you probably heard throughout all those women's stories and the other women that I've spoken with. And I think sometimes women think their work is mundane or uninteresting, but I think from hearing these stories, everybody's story is interesting, and everybody's got something worth hearing about and sharing, and I hope to collect some more stories and share some more.